Picture a tavern full of strangers, every single one of them armed, and not one of them thinking of themselves as dangerous. The eating knife. No forks existed yet. Everyone carried a blade. At dinner, at the market, tucked into a belt without a second thought. The most common weapon in medieval Europe wasn't built for war. It was invisible, because everyone had one. But the next blade gave an entire people their name. The Seax, a single-edged tool so central to daily survival that the Saxons named themselves after it. Ask one of these warriors who he was, and the answer might as well have been the knife on his hip. This wasn't built for armies. It became a weapon only when it had to. A weapon you carried every day eventually wasn't enough for the people who fought for a living. The Scramasax, a heavier, longer cousin of the Seax, carried by warriors who needed something between a tool and a true sword. Some versions stretched long enough to be gripped two-handed in a pinch, a weapon caught between two worlds, neither fully knife nor fully sword, used by raiders who needed to move fast and strike harder than a simple utility blade allowed. A people built around a knife is strange, but one sword from this world survived in a way nobody expected, because nobody could explain how it was made in the first place. The Ulfberht, steel so pure that modern metallurgists initially assumed the inscriptions were forgeries, a purity level Europe wouldn't industrially match for another 500 years. Nobody knows where the technique came from, or why it disappeared. That mystery still sits behind museum glass. While Viking steel stayed shrouded in mystery, an entirely new class of warrior was forming around a sword everyone could recognize. The arming sword. Most knights never owned the rarest blade, or the largest one. They carried this, and it's exactly why so few survive intact today. A weapon this common got used until it broke, melted down, or buried with its owner. The most ordinary sword in medieval Europe is, ironically, one of the hardest to find a perfect surviving example of. Ordinary swords disappeared through overuse, but while knights trusted theirs, soldiers without money found a much cruder solution entirely. The Falchion, heavy near the tip, curved like a cleaver, built entirely on momentum rather than finesse. Swing one with almost no training, and you could still cave in a helmet through sheer weight alone, the kind of damage that normally took years of swordsmanship to produce. Available to anyone strong enough to lift it. Brute force ruled the open field. But while soldiers fought in formation, a different kind of fighting was already replacing it. The Katzbalger. Short, ugly. Built specifically for the moment a battle line broke and men ended up fighting chest to chest, when the spear was useless and the formation was gone. This was the blade Landsknecht mercenaries reached for. Barely longer than a forearm, but exactly the right length for a fight with no room left to swing anything bigger. Close quarters chaos solved one problem. Reach solved a completely different one. The longsword, 2 hands, far greater reach, and more surviving combat manuals than almost any other medieval weapon, enough that techniques lost for centuries have been reconstructed today, almost move by move. Some of those manuals show fighters gripping their own blade halfway up the steel, turning the sword into something closer to a short spear mid-fight. That's a strange kind of fame. The next blade put a knight in an impossible position. The bastard sword. Long enough for 2 hands, light enough for 1, which meant a knight had to decide, in the middle of combat, which grip to commit to. Choose wrong, and you'd find yourself reaching for a second hand that wasn't free, or swinging with the wrong leverage at the exact moment it mattered most. A wrong decision here could cost a fight. Armor created a problem nobody could ignore. For 2 centuries, plate armor made knights feel nearly untouchable. The Estoc. No edge, no flare, a rigid spike built for one purpose, finding the gaps armor couldn't cover. A fortune spent on plate armor came down to roughly 3 exposed inches at the armpit or the visor. The Estoc was built around finding exactly that gap. Every time, armor had a weakness now. But finding the gap was only half the battle. Some soldiers skipped the blade entirely. The war hammer. Not a sword at all, but carried alongside one for exactly this reason. A spike on the back end built to punch through a steel helmet that no blade could cut through. Knights who survived an Estoc to the visor could still be killed seconds later by a hammer they never saw coming. Because by the late medieval period, even swordsmen carried a backup built for exactly this failure point. Armor's weaknesses kept multiplying, but ordinary people faced a completely different problem. They weren't allowed to carry swords at all. The messer, a single-edged blade with a knife-like grip, cheap enough to mass-produce. In parts of medieval Germany, citizens were legally forbidden from carrying actual swords, but a messer, technically classified as a long knife, slipped right through the loophole. An entire underclass walked around armed exactly like knights, hiding behind a technicality. While the streets found a loophole, the Highlands found brute scale instead. The claymore, a Scottish two-hander so large that many modern adults would struggle to touch both ends at once with arms fully extended. Imagine a 6-foot Highland warrior charging a formation, with a blade as tall as a child standing beside him. Soldiers stepped back purely on instinct, before any contact was even made. If the claymore was large, what came next made it look ordinary. The Zweihander, stand one upright beside a modern refrigerator, and the tip would rise above it. These mercenaries, called Doppelsöldner, were paid double a normal soldier's wage, and the reason was brutally simple. Their job was to step first into a wall of enemy pikes. The men assigned to that role often didn't last past the opening seconds of battle. Double pay wasn't a bonus. It was compensation for being the first to die. Size won battles through fear before the first swing landed. So did something far stranger looking. The flamberge, a wave-shaped blade, rippling rather than straight. Wounds from a flamberge were notoriously difficult for period surgeons to treat cleanly. The irregular edge meant a cut rarely closed the way a straight blades would, turning even a survivable hit into a long, painful recovery. Surviving the strike wasn't the same as surviving the wound. The next sword existed only up close, in front of a crowd. The executioner's sword, no point sharp enough to thrust, no refinement for dueling, one purpose only. A single, clean stroke, in public, with no room for failure. Executioners trained for years toward one exact motion, because missing didn't just fail. It meant a crowd watching someone die slowly instead of instantly. That fear was public. The next one was the opposite, a fear nobody could see coming. The sword cane, a blade hidden completely inside an ordinary walking stick. You could share a drink with someone, have a perfectly normal conversation, and never once suspect the cane in their hand could become a weapon before you'd even register the threat. Hiding a blade in plain sight was one trick. The next one hid danger inside the most respected fighting schools in Europe. The Schläger, a dueling blade used in university fencing fraternities, where the goal wasn't death. It was a scar, earned on purpose, worn afterward as proof you didn't flinch. Students lined up to be cut deliberately across the face, because the mark left behind said more about their character than any medal could. Choosing to be cut is one kind of madness. Status became the next one. The rapier, thin, fast, built for the duel rather than open war. For the first time, a sword became less a battlefield weapon and more a wearable status symbol, carried by gentlemen not because they expected to fight, but because not carrying one said something about you. A rapier could still be drawn and thrust before a heavier sword was even lifted off its owner's hip. But increasingly, its sharpest edge was social. Here's what's strange. By the time the rapier appeared, the sword wasn't dying. It was getting more elegant than ever. But elegance wasn't the only direction it evolved. Some blades got smaller instead. Built to disappear into the hand, the main gauche, a short, parrying dagger carried alongside a rapier, used to block, trap, or redirect an opponent's blade. While the rapier delivered the killing strike, duelists weren't fighting with one weapon anymore. They were fighting with two, one hand defending, the other attacking. By the height of rapier fencing, a simple one-sword duel was already starting to look old-fashioned. Two blades at once raised the stakes of every duel, but the final sword on this list wasn't built for dueling, fighting, or war at all. It was built to be seen. The ceremonial sword, oversized, richly decorated, and often too heavy or poorly balanced for real combat. These blades appeared at coronations, royal processions, and state ceremonies, as symbols of authority rather than weapons. Some were never sharpened at all. Think about that. A sword that was never intended to cut anything. The most impressive sword many people would ever see was, ironically, the one least capable of killing anyone. A sword built only to be looked at. And that's what makes what happened next so hard to believe. The death of the sword. For 3,000 years, the sword sat at the center of how humans fought each other. Then gunpowder arrived. A peasant with a few weeks of training and a loaded weapon could kill a master swordsman who had trained his entire life, instantly, from a distance, without ever crossing blades. Think about everything you just watched. The Seax solved survival. The Longsword solved reach. The Estoc solved armor. The Zweihander solved an entire wall of pikes. Every single sword on this list existed because it solved a problem the one before it couldn't. Gunpowder didn't solve a problem the sword had. It solved the sword itself. 3,000 years of evolution. And the only thing that ever truly beat the sword wasn't a better blade. It was the idea that swords were no longer necessary at all.